A Detroit Union Hall, 1962. 50 auto workers gather to hear Malcolm X speak about their rights. The white union president sits in front, waiting to correct whatever Malcolm gets wrong. Malcolm discusses Section 7 rights, the right to organize without employer interference. The president interrupts after 5 minutes. Stands up, tells Malcolm he's oversimplifying complex labor law, says the Wagner Act has specific provisions Malcolm is ignoring. Says workers shouldn't take legal advice from someone who clearly never studied union legislation. Malcolm remains calm. Asks the president to explain Section 8(1) since he's the expert. The president hesitates, gives a vague answer. Malcolm corrects him, quotes the actual text, word for word, from memory. But before we discover what that actual text said and how the union president reacted when Malcolm exposed his ignorance of the law, he claimed to be an expert in, if you appreciate stories about how people in power use complexity as a weapon to keep others ignorant, how union leaders become gatekeepers instead of advocates, how expertise is assumed based on position rather than knowledge. Please subscribe. Hit that like button if you believe workers deserve leaders who actually understand the laws that protect them. These stories matter because they show how institutional power protects itself through assumed authority. Now let's find out exactly what happened when Malcolm started quoting the Wagner Act from memory. The Union Hall is on Michigan Avenue in Detroit. United Auto Workers Local 287. A two-story brick building with a meeting room on the second floor. The room is functional, not fancy. Folding chairs arranged in rows, a small stage at one end, union banners on the walls, photos of past strikes and victories. The smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. This is where Local 287 holds meetings, votes on contracts, organizes actions, the heart of union activity for 3,000 auto workers. It's a Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock. The meeting was scheduled 2 weeks ago, posted on the union bulletin board, Workers' Rights Education Session. Guest speaker Malcolm X. The announcement generated controversy. Some members wanted to hear him. Others objected to bringing in someone from outside the labor movement. The union president, Carl Hendricks, reluctantly agreed because enough members requested it, but he's not happy about it. Carl Hendricks is 62 years old, been with Local 287 for 35 years, started on the assembly line, got involved in union organizing in the late 1920s, survived company violence against union activists, helped build Local 287 from nothing into a powerful force, served as union president for 18 years, negotiated contracts, led strikes, won real gains for workers. He's proud of his record, sees himself as the workers' champion. But Carl has also become comfortable in his position, comfortable with his authority, comfortable with being the expert everyone defers to. He doesn't like being questioned, doesn't like outsiders coming into his union hall and talking about workers' rights. That's his domain, his expertise, his authority. And Malcolm X is an outsider. Someone who never worked in an auto plant, never carried a union card, never walked a picket line. What does Malcolm know about labor law? About collective bargaining? About the real struggles workers face? 50 workers fill the room, all men, mix of ages, some young workers who just started at the plants, some middle-aged men who've been union members for decades, some retirees who still come to meetings out of habit and solidarity. The demographic is predominantly white with about 10 black workers. That ratio reflects the plant demographics. Black workers are underrepresented in skilled positions, overrepresented in dangerous jobs. Malcolm arrives at 6:45, early. He's wearing a dark suit and his glasses, carries a briefcase. A union member meets him at the door, shows him upstairs, offers coffee. Malcolm accepts. They make small talk about Detroit, about the auto industry, about the Nation of Islam temple Malcolm founded in the city. The member is black, one of the 10 black workers present. He's excited Malcolm is here. Feels like someone is finally going to talk about issues the union leadership ignores. Carl Hendricks watches Malcolm from across the room, sizes him up, decides Malcolm looks like an intellectual. Someone who reads books but doesn't understand real work. Someone who's going to give a theoretical lecture that has nothing to do with the practical realities of union organizing. Carl plans to let Malcolm talk for a bit, then step in to correct him, to provide the real expertise workers need. At 7 o'clock, the member who invited Malcolm introduces him, gives a brief background. Malcolm X, minister with the Nation of Islam, civil rights advocate, speaker on workers' rights and economic justice. The room applauds politely. Carl Hendricks doesn't applaud, just sits in the front row, arms crossed, waiting. Malcolm steps to the front of the room. Thanks everyone for coming, says he's honored to speak to union members, says the labor movement and civil rights movement are fighting the same battle. Both fighting for dignity, for fair treatment, for economic justice. Both fighting against systems that exploit working people for profit. He talks about the history of labor law, how workers fought for decades to get federal protection, how the Wagner Act, passed in 1935, was a major victory, how it established workers' fundamental right to organize, to bargain collectively, to strike, how it created the National Labor Relations Board to enforce these rights, how it defined unfair labor practices that employers can't commit. The workers listen. This is familiar territory. Most of them know the basic history. But Malcolm is leading somewhere specific. He's building to a point. Malcolm talks about Section 7 of the Wagner Act, the cornerstone, the section that guarantees workers the right to organize and bargain collectively without employer interference. He explains what this means practically. Employers can't fire workers for union activity, can't threaten workers who organize, can't interrogate workers about union support, can't promise benefits to workers who oppose the union. These are all unfair labor practices under Section 8. 5 minutes into Malcolm's explanation, Carl Hendricks interrupts, stands up, his voice is loud, cutting through Malcolm's measured tone. He says Malcolm is oversimplifying complex labor law, says the Wagner Act has specific provisions and exceptions Malcolm is ignoring, says labor law isn't as simple as Malcolm makes it sound, says it requires years of experience and study to understand properly. The room goes quiet. Everyone turns to look at Carl, then back at Malcolm. This is a direct challenge. Carl is asserting his authority, establishing that he's the real expert, that Malcolm is an outsider who doesn't really understand what he's talking about. Malcolm stops speaking, doesn't look angry or defensive, just waits for Carl to finish. When Carl sits back down, Malcolm nods slightly, acknowledges the interruption, then continues calmly. He says Carl is right that labor law is complex, that there are many provisions and precedents, that understanding it fully requires study. But the fundamentals are clear. Workers have rights. Those rights are defined in federal law, and workers should know what those rights are. Shouldn't have to rely solely on union leadership to tell them what the law says. Carl interrupts again, stands up again, says workers shouldn't take legal advice from someone who clearly never studied union legislation. Says Malcolm means well but doesn't have the expertise to teach labor law. Says the workers should listen to people who've actually been in the trenches, who've negotiated contracts, who understand how this actually works. Several workers shift uncomfortably. They came to hear Malcolm, but Carl is their union president. The man who negotiates their contracts, the man who leads their strikes. His authority matters, his opinion carries weight. They're caught between wanting to hear Malcolm and not wanting to contradict their own leadership. Malcolm remains calm, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't attack Carl personally, just asks a simple question. Since Carl is the expert on the Wagner Act, perhaps he could explain Section 801 for the workers, just to make sure everyone understands it correctly. Carl wasn't expecting this. He was expecting Malcolm to back down, to defer to his expertise, to acknowledge that he's out of his depth. Instead, Malcolm is asking him to demonstrate his knowledge, putting him on the spot in front of 50 members. Carl hesitates. Section 801, he knows it has something to do with unfair labor practices, but the specific text, the exact provision. He's negotiated contracts for 18 years, but he doesn't actually have the Wagner Act memorized. He relies on the union's lawyer for specific legal citations. He knows the practical application, not the precise legal language. He gives a vague answer, says Section 801 deals with employer interference in union activities, says it prohibits companies from interfering with workers' rights. That's correct in general terms. But it's not the specific legal text, it's a summary, an approximation. Malcolm listens, then speaks. His voice is still calm, still measured. He says that's close, but not quite complete. Then he recites the actual text of Section 801. It shall be an unfair labor practice for an employer to interfere with, restrain or coerce employees in the exercise of the rights guaranteed in Section 7. Word for word. Perfect accuracy. Malcolm quotes it like he's reading from the statute, but he's not reading from anything. He's reciting from memory. He knows the exact legal language. The room is completely silent. 50 workers staring at Malcolm, then at Carl. Carl's face is red, embarrassed, angry. He just got corrected on labor law by someone he claimed didn't understand labor law. Got corrected, in front of his own members, by someone quoting the actual statute, while Carl could only give a vague paraphrase. Malcolm continues, asks if Carl would like to discuss Section 8 of Free, or perhaps Section 9, or maybe Section 10, regarding NLRB enforcement procedures. Malcolm can recite any of them, can discuss the case law that interprets them, can explain how they apply practically to workers in this room. Carl sits down, doesn't respond, can't respond. Malcolm just demonstrated knowledge Carl doesn't have, demonstrated it publicly, undeniably, in a way that can't be dismissed or explained away. Malcolm returns to his presentation, talks about how Section 8 defines 5 categories of unfair labor practices, explains each one, provides examples relevant to auto workers, discusses what workers can do if their employer violates their rights, how to file charges with the NLRB, what the process looks like, what remedies are available. The workers listen intently now. They just watched Malcolm out-expert their union president, watched him quote law from memory that their president couldn't accurately cite. Whatever skepticism they had about Malcolm's expertise is gone. He's proven he knows what he's talking about, knows it better than their own leadership. Malcolm talks for another 30 minutes, covers Section 7 rights in detail, explains how those rights extend beyond just organizing and bargaining, how they protect workers who act together for mutual aid or protection, how they cover complaints about working conditions, wage discussions, safety concerns, how speaking up about problems at work is protected activity under federal law. He explains something the workers didn't know, that the Wagner Act protects not just union activity, but any concerted activity. Workers don't need union approval to exercise Section 7 rights. If 2 or more workers go together to complain about unsafe conditions, that's protected. If workers discuss their wages with each other, that's protected. The employer can't retaliate. This is information Carl never shared, not because he's deliberately hiding it, but because he doesn't know it. His understanding of labor law is practical and experiential, not legal and precise. He knows how to negotiate contracts and organize strikes, but he doesn't know the actual statutory framework as deeply as he thinks he does. Malcolm finishes his presentation, opens the floor for questions. Hands go up immediately. Workers want details, want to know how specific situations apply, want to understand their rights more clearly. One worker asks about whether discussing wages violates company policy. His employer has a rule against employees discussing compensation. Is that legal? Malcolm explains it's not. The National Labor Relations Act explicitly protects wage discussions, Section 7. Rights include discussing terms and conditions of employment. Wages are terms and conditions of employment. Therefore, wage discussions are protected. Any company policy prohibiting them violates federal law. The worker can file an NLRB charge. Carl didn't know this. He told members to follow company policies even when those policies seemed unfair, told them not to rock the boat. Didn't realize some of those policies violated federal law. Another worker asks about being required to attend anti-union meetings. His company holds captive audience meetings where management argues against unionizing. Does he have to attend? Malcolm explains the law is complicated there. Employers can require attendance, but employees have the right to leave if the meeting goes beyond the employer's free speech rights under Section 8. If the meeting includes threats or promises, employees can leave, and they can report it to the NLRB. Question after question, Malcolm answers each one. Sometimes he references specific NLRB decisions. Sometimes he cites court cases. Always he explains not just what the answer is, but why, what the legal principle is, how it connects to workers' fundamental rights. Carl sits in the front row, silent. Watching Malcolm teach his members things Carl didn't know. Watching them ask Malcolm questions instead of him. Watching his authority dissolve. After an hour of questions, the session ends. Workers crowd around Malcolm, want to thank him, want his contact information. This is the reception Carl usually gets. But tonight, it's Malcolm receiving it. One black worker tells Malcolm the union leadership often ignores issues affecting black workers. Dangerous assignments, discriminatory discipline, passed over for promotions. The union says those are workplace issues, not union issues. Malcolm says that's wrong. If black workers organize to address these issues collectively, that's protected Section 7 activity. The employer can't retaliate, and the union has a duty of fair representation. Can't ignore members' concerns based on race. The worker didn't know this. Carl never explained it. Carl focused on wages and benefits, treated discrimination as a civil rights issue, not a labor issue. But Malcolm just showed they're the same thing. Labor law protects workers against all workplace injustice. Carl watches this conversation, sees Malcolm talking to black members, sees their engagement, sees them taking notes. Malcolm is organizing within his union, building consciousness among members. Carl neglected. Malcolm leaves at 9:30. Thanks the workers. Says he's available if they need help. Gives them the temple address where he can be reached. Walks out. Carl stays behind. Several workers ask why he didn't teach them what Malcolm taught. Ask why he doesn't know the Wagner Act as well as Malcolm. Ask why they're just learning about protections they've had for years. Carl doesn't have good answers. Says he's been focused on practical organizing, on negotiations, on building union strength. Says knowing every legal detail isn't as important as knowing how to fight the company. But his answers sound weak, sound like excuses for ignorance. Over the following weeks, Carl starts studying the Wagner Act, actually studying it, reading the statute, reading NLRB decisions, learning the legal framework he's operated in for years without fully understanding. He's embarrassed by what he discovers, how much he didn't know, how many times he gave members incorrect information, how many opportunities he missed because he didn't understand what the law actually allows. Some members start citing Malcolm's explanations in union meetings. Start talking about Section 7 rights. Start filing NLRB charges when the company violates those rights. Start organizing among themselves on issues Carl never addressed. The union becomes more active, more knowledgeable, more effective, not because of Carl's leadership, because Malcolm spent 2 hours teaching them what Carl didn't know. Carl resents this. Resents Malcolm for exposing his ignorance, resents the members for going around him. Resents having to admit he doesn't know everything, but he can't deny the results. Members are more empowered, more informed, better able to defend themselves. That's supposed to be the point of unions. 3 years later, Carl retires. A younger member runs for union president. Someone who was at Malcolm's session, someone who took Malcolm's lesson to heart, someone who believes union leadership should be based on knowledge and service, not just seniority and authority. He wins. Starts implementing changes, making the union more democratic, more accountable, more focused on actually protecting worker rights, as defined in federal law. When people ask him why he ran, he tells them about the night Malcolm X taught local 287 members more about labor law in 2 hours than they'd learned in years of union membership. About watching the union president get exposed as less knowledgeable than the guest speaker. About realizing that workers deserve better, that they deserve leaders who actually know the law they claim to represent. If this story made you think about how expertise gets assumed based on position, how people in power maintain authority through mystification, how institutional knowledge gets hoarded instead of shared, hit that like button if you believe workers deserve leaders who empower them with knowledge instead of keeping them dependent. Consider who you trust because of their title versus their actual knowledge. Consider what changes when people learn they don't have to rely on gatekeepers to access information that belongs to them.